My name is Charlotte Whitfield, 32 years old. Until last year, I owned the Rosewood, the beloved restaurant my grandmother left me. My cousin Nathaniel and my parents demanded I hand him half ownership. When I refused, they took matters into their own hands in the most devastating way imaginable. They burned my restaurant to the ground, my heritage, my everything. But what the judge revealed in court shook our entire city to its core. The Rosewood was never just a restaurant. It was the culmination of my grandmother Margaret's dreams. She built it 50 years ago at 25, a single mother with a gift for Southern cooking and a stubborn streak wider than the Thames. It started as a 6-table diner and grew, slowly and honestly, into one of the most respected establishments in the city. My bond with Grandma Margaret was different from anything else in my life. While my parents chased dinner parties and golf memberships, and Nathaniel chased whatever shiny thing was dangled in front of him, Margaret made time for me. I was her shadow, her sous chef in training, her pride. By 10, I could make her buttermilk biscuits blindfolded. By 12, she trusted me with the secret barbecue sauce recipe, a trust she did not extend to a single other living soul, including, memorably, the health inspector, who once tried to charm it out of her and left with nothing but a complimentary slice of pie and a stern lecture on the sanctity of family recipes. "Charlotte, love," she used to say, flower on her nose. "In this business you're not selling food. You're selling memory, comfort, and a little piece of home." I believed her then. I believe her more now. My relationship with Nathaniel was the opposite kind of story. 3 years older, he was the undisputed golden child. While I scrubbed pots with Margaret, he was shuttled between football practice, piano lessons, and enrichment camps that seemed to enrich mainly the camp director's bank accounts. For my 10th birthday I got a cookbook and measuring spoons. For his 10th, he got a computer and a birthday party so lavish it required a professional balloon architect. I am not exaggerating, there was a balloon archway. I still think about that archway. I learned early to be self-sufficient. Nathaniel learned that the universe generally apologized to him when things went wrong. As we grew, the gap widened into a canyon. I worked through school, studied business and culinary arts, and became a sous chef at a respected city restaurant by the time I graduated. Nathaniel dropped out of 3 universities, each time with a new excuse more creative than the last. My personal favorite being the semester he blamed his failing grades on administrative sabotage from a professor he had never actually met. Through it all, Margaret aged, and I helped more. Every recipe in that kitchen told a story. The peach cobbler from her mother, the fried chicken perfected during a brutal winter, the collard greens taught to her by an elderly neighbor who guarded the secret to removing bitterness like it was a state secret. I absorbed those stories the way the kitchen absorbed decades of wood smoke and butter. We never spoke directly of inheritance. We didn't need to. There was an understanding, quiet and certain like the tide. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, the phone rang while I was at the farmer's market. Margaret had collapsed in the kitchen. By the time I reached the hospital, she was gone. A heart attack, the doctor said. Quick. Nothing about the hole she left behind was quick. The funeral was my parents' production. An expensive casket, towering flower arrangements, a minister Margaret had met exactly twice. It was theater for their social circle, not a tribute to the woman we buried. A week later, we gathered at the office of Mr. Abernathy, Margaret's attorney, for the reading of the will. My parents sat stiff and expectant. Nathaniel scrolled his phone like he was waiting for a bus. Then came the sentence that detonated the room. Margaret had left the Rosewood, building, business, everything, entirely to me. My father erupted. My mother produced tears that seemed more furious than sad. Nathaniel stood so fast he knocked his chair over and sent a decorative vase shattering across the floor, shouting that he was family too. Mr. Abernathy, unbothered by the chaos, a man who had clearly seen worse in 30 years of estate law, calmly produced a letter Margaret had written in anticipation of exactly this reaction. In it, she explained she'd watched me pour my heart into the Rosewood for years while Nathaniel showed interest in it only when money was involved, and my parents treated it as a quaint hobby. She wanted it to thrive, not be carved up and sold for parts. Can this be contested? my father demanded, snatching the letter. Mrs. Whitfield's competency was fully documented, Mr. Abernathy replied. 2 independent physicians confirmed her sound mind 6 months ago. The bequest is binding. That was the opening shot in a war I never asked to fight. Taking over the Rosewood full-time was exhilarating and frankly terrifying, the restaurant equivalent of being handed the keys to a plane mid-flight and told, "Good luck, you've watched other people land these." I discovered invoices I didn't understand, vendor relationships that needed careful tending, and an ancient walk-in freezer that made a noise like a dying whale every time it kicked on. Gradually I found my footing. I kept Margaret's classics, the biscuits, the sauce, while adding seasonal specials that were unmistakably mine. I modernized the reservation system, gave the dining room a gentle refresh, and started a modest social media presence. Business improved. Local food writers took notice. Even the city's notoriously hard-to-please restaurant critic, a man rumored to smile only at obituaries, declared the Rosewood was entering a confident new era. My family's campaign against me escalated in response, as though my success were a personal insult. Angry calls, fake negative reviews online, which I spent hours disputing with increasingly patient customer service reps. Then Nathaniel started showing up drunk during dinner service, once standing in the middle of the dining room shouting that I'd stolen his birthright while our guests stared into their soup, deeply unsure whether this counted as complimentary entertainment. I had to call the police. Afterward, I personally apologized to every table and comped dessert, which is a genuinely humbling way to spend a Friday night. My father's warning the next morning had a chill to it. There will be consequences. I filed a restraining order. I installed security cameras. I should have installed them sooner, but hindsight, as they say, runs a very successful restaurant of its own. Through it all, my head server, Oliver, became my closest ally. He'd started as a college student and stayed on, rising to head server, and he'd known Margaret well. "You're doing exactly what she'd have wanted," he told me one night over closing time wine. His steadiness became a kind of scaffolding I didn't know I needed. Then came the call at 2:17 in the morning. Fire Chief Bennett's voice, grim and formal. There had been a fire at the restaurant. I ran 2 red lights getting there. The sky over Rosewood Lane glowed orange. Firefighters blocked the street. And there it was. 50 years of history engulfed. "The building's a total loss," a firefighter told me, and I remember thinking absurdly that I should write that down, that Margaret would want the exact words for posterity. Grief does strange, specific things to a person. By dawn, Chief Bennett delivered the second blow. This was no accident. Accelerant, multiple points of origin. Arson. Security footage from the pharmacy across the street, ours had burned with everything else, caught 2 figures circling the building at 1:30 a.m. Even in grainy black and white, I recognized Nathaniel's walk and my father's shoulders. They were arrested. My mother called that evening, alternating between sobbing and blaming me, in a rhetorical technique I can only describe as emotional whack-a-mole. A week later, still barely functioning, Oliver showed up with a folder. Inside was an insurance policy on the Rosewood with coverage far beyond what I'd ever purchased, taken out 3 months earlier, my signature forged, and, the kicker, Nathaniel listed as secondary beneficiary. It wasn't just revenge. It was fraud. They'd planned to burn down my inheritance and cash the check. "I'm taking this to the police," Oliver said, gathering the papers. "And then you and I are going to figure out next steps. Margaret wouldn't want you to give up. Neither will I." Weeks later, I sat in the office of attorney Vivian Ashworth. Sharp-eyed, unflappable, the kind of lawyer who could make a hardened conman feel personally attacked with a single arched eyebrow. She reviewed the forged policy, the pharmacy footage, the police reports, months of threatening texts. "You have a strong case," she said. "Criminal and civil." "They're still my family," I said quietly. "What they did isn't just horrible," Vivian replied. "It's criminal. Is letting them collect on it what your grandmother would have wanted?" It wasn't. We moved forward. The trial began that August. My father and Nathaniel arrived looking scrubbed and respectable, their defense attorney, Reginald Foster, a man with a theatrical flair of someone who'd once seriously considered a career in community theater, painting me as a granddaughter who'd manipulated a dying woman out of her family. Vivian, in contrast, laid out a calm, damning timeline. Harassment, forged documents, premeditated arson. She projected an email exchange between my father and Nathaniel, written 2 weeks before the fire, gloating about the payout and my coming ruin. The courtroom actually gasped. I did not know courtrooms did that outside of television, but apparently they do. On the third day, Judge Eleanor Pierce called an abrupt recess. When court reconvened, she announced that new documents had come to light, documents that bore directly on the case. It turned out Nathaniel was not biologically my parents' son at all, but the child of my father's late brother, adopted in infancy and never told the truth. And the second bombshell. Years earlier, my parents had attempted to forge documents pressuring Margaret to change her will while she was alive. She'd caught them and quietly, deliberately, added extra legal protections to make absolutely sure I'd inherit the rosewood cleanly. Grandma Margaret, it turned out, had been 3 steps ahead of everyone in that room the entire time. The woman genuinely could not be outmaneuvered, not even from beyond the grave. The courtroom dissolved into shocked murmuring. Nathaniel, learning on the spot that his entire identity had been a fabrication, lunged toward my father and had to be restrained by the bailiff, shouting that his whole life was a lie, which, to be fair, was an understatement. Both men pleaded guilty to most charges shortly after. My father received 5 years for arson, fraud, and conspiracy. Nathaniel received 3 years with mandatory counseling. Both owed restitution. 1 year after the fire, I stood on the cleared lot where the rosewood once stood, restitution and savings finally enough to rebuild. I named the new restaurant Margaret's Promise. Oliver, who'd left his old job to become my operations manager, and somewhere in the wreckage and rebuilding, my partner, stood beside me as we cut the ribbon. Healing took longer than construction. Therapy helped me untangle a childhood built on favoritism I hadn't fully understood was there. My mother wrote, eventually, admitting jealousy she'd carried for years over the ease between Margaret and me. Nathaniel wrote too, with more self-awareness than I'd ever seen from him, admitting he'd spent his whole life trying to prove he belonged to a family that was never fully honest with him either. My father's letter from prison came last, quiet and unpolished, an apology with no requests attached. None of it was forgiveness, not yet. But it was a crack in a wall I'd thought was permanent. On opening day at Margaret's Promise, the line stretched around the block. I stepped into the small office off the kitchen, looked at Margaret's photograph on the wall, and said thank you. Not just for the restaurant, but for the harder gift. The courage to stand firm, the resilience to rebuild from ash, and the wisdom to know that losing what you thought you needed can lead you to what you actually deserve. The lesson, if there is one, inheritance was never really about the building. It was about who showed up for the work when no one was watching, and who only showed up once there was something to take.